The gates of Troy open. Thousands of people walk outside the walls. They see a giant wooden horse standing on the empty battlefield. The horse is huge, taller than any building in the city. The people are happy. They believe the war is over. They believe the Greek army has left forever. Tonight, there will be music and dancing inside Troy. Nobody knows that this is their last night alive. This is the story of the Trojan War. How did one woman start a war that lasted 10 years? Why did the strongest army in the world need a wooden horse to win? To answer that, you have to go back to the beginning. One choice can start a war that no one can stop. Long ago in the world of Greek gods and heroes, there was a wedding. The wedding was for Peleus, a great king, and Thetis, a sea goddess. Almost every god came to celebrate, but one goddess was not invited. Her name was Eris, the goddess of chaos. Eris was angry. She wanted revenge. So she threw a golden apple into the wedding hall. Words were written on the apple, "For the most beautiful." 3 goddesses saw the apple at the same time. Hera, the queen of the gods, wanted it. Athena, the goddess of wisdom, wanted it too. And Aphrodite, the goddess of love, also wanted it. All 3 believed they were the most beautiful. None of them would give up. The 3 goddesses started to argue. The argument grew louder. Finally, they needed someone to judge. They needed someone to choose. So the gods sent them to a young man on earth. His name was Paris, a prince of Troy. Paris was handsome. Paris was young, but Paris had no idea what was coming. The 3 goddesses appeared before him. Each one offered him a gift. Hera offered him power over all of Asia. Athena offered him wisdom and victory in every battle, but Aphrodite offered him something different. She offered him love. She promised him the most beautiful woman in the world. Paris did not choose power. Paris did not choose wisdom. Paris chose love. He gave the golden apple to Aphrodite. But there was a problem, a big problem. The most beautiful woman in the world already had a husband. Then Paris made his choice. Her name was Helen. She lived in Sparta, a powerful kingdom in Greece. Her husband was King Menelaus. Helen was known across the land for her beauty. People said no woman could compare to her. Aphrodite kept her promise. She led Paris to Sparta. Paris arrived as a guest. King Menelaus welcomed him into his home. This was normal in ancient Greece. Guests were treated with honor and respect. But Paris did not act like a normal guest. While Menelaus was away, Paris and Helen spent time together. Aphrodite filled Helen's heart with love for Paris. Some old stories say Helen went with Paris freely. Other stories say Paris took her by force. Nobody knows the full truth today, but one thing is certain. Helen left Sparta with Paris. They sailed across the sea to Troy. When Menelaus came home, his house was empty. His wife was gone. His guest was gone too. In one single night, everything changed. Menelaus felt anger. He felt shame. In ancient Greece, this was not just about love. This was about honor. A guest had betrayed his host. A wife had left her husband. The whole kingdom had been insulted. Menelaus could not fight Troy alone. Troy was too strong, too far away, too well protected. So Menelaus needed help. He needed an army, and he knew exactly who to ask. Menelaus called his brother. His brother's name was Agamemnon. Agamemnon was the most powerful king in Greece. He ruled the city of Mycenae. He had wealth, he had soldiers, he had influence over other kings. Agamemnon agreed to help his brother, but he needed more than his own army. He needed every kingdom in Greece to join the war. Many years before, something important had happened. When Helen was still young and unmarried, many kings wanted to marry her. Her father was worried. He feared that the losing kings would attack the winner, so he made all of them take an oath. Each king promised to defend Helen's marriage, no matter who she chose to marry. Now that old oath became a weapon. Agamemnon reminded every king of their promise. One by one, the kings agreed to fight. Ships began to gather at a place called Aulis. But one hero was missing. His name was Achilles. Achilles was young, but he was already the greatest warrior alive. A prophecy said that Troy could never fall without him. His mother, a goddess named Thetis, knew this prophecy too. She also knew something darker. If Achilles went to Troy, he would die there. So she hid him, dressed as a girl, on a faraway island. But the Greeks were clever. They found a way to test the girls on the island. They placed weapons among gifts. Achilles, without thinking, picked up a sword. His true identity was revealed. Achilles agreed to join the war. He knew he might die, but he chose glory instead of a long, quiet life. Now the fleet was ready. More than 1,000 ships waited at Aulis, but the wind refused to blow. The ships could not sail. A priest gave terrible news. The goddess Artemis was angry with Agamemnon. To satisfy her, he had to sacrifice something precious. He had to sacrifice his own daughter, Iphigenia. Agamemnon faced an impossible choice. If he refused, the war would never begin. If he agreed, he would lose his child. In the end, Agamemnon chose the war. His daughter was sacrificed. The wind returned. The ships could sail. One choice can start a war that no one can stop. Then the ships sailed. The Greek fleet reached the shores near Troy. Thousands of soldiers landed on the beach. The war for Helen had officially begun. But Troy was not an easy target. The city had massive stone walls. These walls were said to be built by gods. No army had ever broken through them. The Greeks set up camp outside the city. They prepared for a long fight. Days turned into months. Months turned into years. The war continued year after year without a clear winner. The Greeks could not break the walls of Troy. The people of Troy could not push the Greeks back into the sea. Both sides fought again and again. Both sides lost soldiers and heroes, but the war did not end. During these years, Achilles proved why he was called the greatest warrior. He fought with incredible speed and strength. Some stories say his mother had dipped him in a magic river as a baby. This made his whole body impossible to harm, almost his whole body. One small part of him, his heel, stayed weak. Nobody knew this weakness yet, not even Achilles' enemies. On the other side, Troy also had a great hero. His name was Hector, a prince of Troy and the brother of Paris. Hector was brave, loyal, and deeply loved by his people. He was not as fast as Achilles, but he was strong and wise. He led the Trojan army with courage. Small battles happened constantly. Warriors died on both sides. Cities near Troy were attacked and destroyed. Still, the main walls of Troy stood firm. After 9 long years, the war looked exactly the same as it did at the beginning. 9 years of blood, 9 years of loss, and still the gates of Troy remained closed. Then in the 10th year, everything changed. Not because of a new weapon, not because of a new army. It changed because of anger, one man's anger that nearly destroyed the Greek forces from the inside. Then Achilles got angry. In the 10th year of the war, a serious conflict broke out among the Greeks themselves. It started with a woman named Briseis. She had been captured during the war and given to Achilles as a prize of honor. Agamemnon, the leader of the Greek army, had also lost a prize of his own. To replace it, he decided to take Briseis away from Achilles. This was a massive insult. In that culture, honor meant everything to a warrior. Achilles was furious. He felt betrayed by his own leader. In front of the entire army, Achilles made a decision. He refused to fight anymore. He withdrew to his tent along with his soldiers and watched the war from a distance. This decision changed everything. Without Achilles, the Greek army grew weaker. Their strongest warrior was gone. Hector saw his chance. He led the Trojan soldiers forward with new confidence. Battle after battle, the Greeks were pushed back. Soon the Trojans reached the Greek ships near the shore. This was a terrifying moment for the Greeks. If their ships burned, they would have no way to return home. Fear spread through the Greek camp. Their strongest fighter refused to help them. Death felt closer than ever. One man's anger was breaking an entire army. Even Agamemnon began to regret his decision. He offered gifts to Achilles. He offered Briseis back. He offered treasure and honor, but Achilles refused everything. His pride had been wounded too deeply. He stayed in his tent while his fellow soldiers suffered outside. Then someone close to Achilles made a choice that would change history. Then Patroclus put on the armor. Patroclus was Achilles' closest friend. They had grown up together. They had trained together since they were boys. Patroclus watched the Greek army suffer day after day. He watched the ships almost catch fire. He could not stay silent any longer. Patroclus went to Achilles with a plan. He begged Achilles to let him wear his armor. If the Trojans saw the famous armor of Achilles, they would believe the great warrior had returned. This fear alone might push them back. Achilles agreed, but only partly. He allowed Patroclus to fight, but he gave him one clear warning. Push the Trojans away from the ships, he said. Then stop. Do not chase them all the way to the walls of Troy. Patroclus put on the armor. He looked like Achilles from a distance. He led the soldiers back into battle with new energy. At first, the plan worked perfectly. The Trojans saw the armor and felt fear. They believed Achilles had returned to the war. They ran back in panic. The Greek ships were finally safe. But Patroclus did not stop there. The excitement of victory filled his mind. He forgot the warning from his friend. He chased the retreating soldiers all the way toward the walls of Troy. This choice would cost him his life. Hector stood before the gates, ready to defend his city. He saw a warrior in the armor of Achilles, and he prepared for a hard fight. But this was not Achilles. This was Patroclus, wearing armor that was not truly his own. The two men fought fiercely. In the end, Hector defeated Patroclus. Patroclus fell to the ground, and the armor of Achilles now belonged to Hector. News of this death traveled fast through the Greek camp. When Achilles heard that his friend was dead, something inside him broke completely. His anger toward Agamemnon disappeared instantly. A new, much darker feeling took its place. Grief turned into pure rage. Achilles no longer cared about pride or honor from his own leader. He cared about only one thing now: revenge. The death of one friend did what an entire army could not do. It brought the greatest warrior back to war. Then Achilles came back. Achilles returned to the battlefield like a storm. His grief had transformed into something terrifying. He fought without fear. He fought without mercy. Trojan soldiers fell before him one after another. Even the river near Troy became filled with bodies, according to the old stories. The Trojan army retreated in fear. Soldiers ran back inside the city walls as fast as they could. All of them ran except for one man. Hector stayed outside the gates. Hector knew what he had done. He had killed Patroclus. He knew Achilles was coming for him, and only him. His family begged him to come inside the walls. His father cried out to him. His mother cried out to him. But Hector remained standing outside the city. He was afraid, but he refused to run. He believed in his duty to his people. As Achilles came closer, though, fear finally took over. Hector turned and ran around the walls of Troy, with Achilles chasing close behind him. 3 times they ran around the entire city. Finally, Hector stopped. He turned to face his enemy. He chose to die like a warrior, not like a frightened man running from his fate. The two greatest fighters of the war stood face to face. Achilles attacked with all of his strength and speed. Hector fought bravely, but he could not match the fury of Achilles. In the end, Achilles struck the final blow. Hector fell to the ground, dead. But Achilles' anger was not finished, even after Hector's death. He tied Hector's body to his chariot. He dragged the body around the walls of Troy again and again in front of the grieving Trojan people. This was a moment of deep cruelty. Even the gods watched with sadness. Eventually, King Priam, Hector's own father, walked bravely into the Greek camp. He kneeled before Achilles and begged for his son's body back. Achilles, for the first time in a long while, felt something close to peace. He agreed. He returned Hector's body to his father. But the story of Achilles was not finished yet either. Not long after, Achilles continued fighting in the war. According to legend, Paris shot an arrow toward him, guided by the god Apollo. The arrow struck Achilles in his one weak spot, his heel, the place his mother had missed so many years earlier. The greatest warrior of Greece, the man almost impossible to kill, fell because of one small, hidden weakness. His death shocked the entire Greek army. If Achilles could die, then this war could destroy anyone. But the war did not stop. The Greeks needed a new plan, a way to finally break through the walls that had stood for 10 long years. Then the Greeks needed a new plan. 10 years of fighting had brought neither side a true victory. Both armies were exhausted. Both sides had lost their greatest heroes. Troy's walls still stood, strong and unbroken. A new idea was needed, something no one had ever tried before. That idea came from a clever Greek warrior named Odysseus. He was not the strongest fighter in the army, but he was the smartest. Odysseus believed that Troy could not be defeated by force alone. It had to be defeated by trickery. His plan was bold and strange. The Greeks would build a massive wooden horse. Inside its hollow body, a small group of soldiers would hide. The rest of the Greek army would pretend to give up. They would burn their camp and sail their ships away, as if they were finally sailing home. The wooden horse would be left behind on the beach, as a gift to the gods. The Greeks hoped the Trojans would believe the war was truly over. The plan began. Greek craftsmen built an enormous horse from wood. Soldiers climbed inside its body and waited in complete silence. The rest of the army burned their tents and sailed their ships out of sight, hiding behind a nearby island. The next morning, the people of Troy woke up to a strange sight. The Greek camp was empty. The ships were gone. Only the giant wooden horse remained on the beach. The Trojans walked outside their walls, confused and curious. 10 years of war seemed to be over just like that. They believed the horse was a victory gift or a peace offering to the gods. Some among them were suspicious. A priest named Laocoon warned his people not to trust it. He said the horse could be dangerous, a trick from their enemies. But the warning was ignored. In the end, joy and excitement were stronger than caution. The people of Troy decided to bring the horse inside their city. They believed the long war was truly finished. They opened their gates that had protected them for 10 years without ever falling. They pulled the massive horse through the streets, all the way to the center of Troy. That night, the entire city celebrated. Music filled the streets. Wine flowed freely. For the first time in 10 years, the people of Troy felt safe. But safety was only an illusion. As the city slept, the hidden Greek soldiers slowly climbed out of the wooden horse. They moved quietly through the streets. They opened the main gates of Troy from the inside. Outside, the Greek ships had already returned under the darkness of night. The full Greek army marched silently back toward the city they had failed to conquer for 10 long years. Then Troy burned. The fall of Troy happened in a single night. For 10 years, the Greeks had failed to break through the walls of the city. Now, inside their own home, the people of Troy had no defense left. Greek soldiers spread through the streets. Fire began to rise from house after house. The city that had stood for so long was now burning from the inside. Screams filled the air. People ran through the streets in panic, trying to escape the chaos around them. The soldiers of Troy tried to fight back, but the surprise was too complete. Many woke up from sleep only to face swords and fire. There was no time to organize a defense. There was no time to close the gates again. The war that had lasted 10 long years ended in just a few dark hours. King Priam, the old ruler of Troy, was killed inside his own palace. Many members of the royal family died that same night. Others were captured and taken away as prisoners. The great city of Troy, once powerful and proud, was destroyed completely. Its buildings burned to the ground. Its walls, the walls that no army could break for 10 years, finally fell from the inside. Paris, the man whose choice had started this entire war, also died during the fighting. Some old stories say he was killed by an arrow, much like Achilles had been. His decision, made years earlier at a wedding for a golden apple, had led to the destruction of his entire city. And Helen, the woman at the center of it all, was finally found. King Menelaus, her husband, searched for her inside the burning city. Different old stories describe this moment in different ways. Some say Menelaus wanted to kill her immediately for the pain she had caused. Other stories say her beauty stopped him, and he chose to forgive her instead. In the end, most versions agree on one thing. Helen returned to Sparta with Menelaus, and the long war that bore her name finally came to its end. By morning, Troy no longer existed as a living city. Smoke rose into the sky where strong walls once stood. A war that began with a golden apple, a broken promise, and one impossible choice had ended in fire and silence. 10 years, one night, and a city that would never rise again. Now think back to that wooden horse standing outside the gates. Think about the people of Troy walking outside their walls, feeling joy for the first time in 10 years. They believed their suffering was finally over. They believed peace had come at last. But that moment of happiness was actually the closest they had ever been to complete disaster. That is the real heart of this story. How did one woman start a war that lasted 10 years? The truth is, Helen alone did not start this war. A choice started it. Paris chose love over wisdom and power at a wedding filled with gods. That single choice pulled kings, warriors, and entire nations into 10 years of bloodshed. Helen was the reason people remembered, but the real cause was much deeper. It was pride. It was desire. It was the belief that one small decision would never lead to something so large and so terrible. Why did the strongest army in the world need a wooden horse to win? Because strength alone was never enough. For 9 long years, Greek soldiers threw themselves against the walls of Troy, and the walls did not break. Muscles and swords could not solve this problem. In the end, it was not raw power that ended the war. It was a clever idea, a moment of trickery, and one final decision made by the people of Troy themselves. They opened their own gates. Nobody forced them to do it. One choice can start a war that no one can stop. You saw this truth again and again throughout this story. Paris made one choice at a wedding, and it eventually burned an entire city to the ground. Agamemnon made one choice to sacrifice his daughter, and the ships finally sailed to war. Achilles made one choice to leave the battlefield, and his own army nearly lost everything. Patroclus made one choice to chase the enemy too far, and it cost him his life. And the people of Troy made one final choice, to open their gates for a strange wooden gift, and it destroyed everything they had protected for 10 long years. Every hero in this story believed they were making a small decision. None of them understood how far the consequences would travel. This is why the story of the Trojan War still matters today, thousands of years later. It is not just a tale about gods, heroes, and ancient battles. It is a story about human nature. It shows how pride can grow into disaster. It shows how one moment of anger, like the anger of Achilles, can change the outcome of an entire war. It shows how one moment of trust, like the trust of the Trojans in that wooden horse, can destroy everything a person has built. We often imagine that history changes because of huge armies, powerful kings, or massive battles. But this story teaches something different. History often changes because of small, personal choices. A young prince chooses love at a wedding. A leader chooses his pride over his soldiers. A friend chooses loyalty over caution. A whole city chooses hope over doubt. None of these choices seemed like they would shake the world. Yet together they shaped one of the most famous wars in human history. Even now, so many centuries later, people still remember the name of Troy. They remember Achilles and his terrible anger. They remember Hector, brave until his final moment. They remember Helen, blamed for a war she did not start alone. And they remember that wooden horse, standing quietly outside the gates, holding the fate of an entire civilization inside its wooden body. The people of Troy looked at that horse and saw a symbol of peace. In truth, it was the final choice in a long chain of choices, the one that finally brought their story to an end. Wars don't start with armies. They start with one small choice.